Thank you, Chairperson. I must just say that I was kind of hoping that you wouldn't pitch. Then this would be the first kind of anarchist panel in the conference, but you did, so we stuck with you now. I know this is a late session, so I'm going to try and speak for less than the 10 minutes that I've been allocated, and hopefully succeed in doing that. So I want to raise 3 or 4 points, and I'll raise them as briefly as I possibly can. I'm not going to talk about the history of international or foreign, rather, intervention in the Middle East, North Africa region, but speak more about the recent past, the past few years, and perhaps a bit about the future. I think that the time the time of unfettered and unquestioned dominance of outside powers in the Middle East and North Africa region is over. That has lasted for a long time, as the previous speaker indicated, but I think that it is now over. That Middle East countries now respond to foreign pressures and all kinds of interventions in ways that are more akin to or more aligned with their interests or their perceived interests rather than with the interests of these foreign powers. And this is, it's much clearer in the past 4 or 5 years, but of course it's not just the past 4 or 5 years. Certainly we've seen 1 or 2 instances of very firm and determined breaks from foreign intervention, the Iranian Revolution being one, for example. But what we're seeing over the past 4 or 5 years since the uprisings began in 2010, 2011 is more of this kind of an attempt by most of these countries to chart their own independent roads or independent paths. And perhaps good examples, because they are so stark, might be Saudi Arabia or Egypt, because both have been very close to the United States and both have, in the past few years, broken that kind of pattern in some or other way. Now, of course, this notion might be difficult to accept when one considers particularly Syria and the level of foreign intervention in Syria. With Russia bombing Aleppo to God knows where, and the United States having its own bombing campaign, as well as France and Britain and all kinds of other forces that are in there. But perhaps Syria is not a good example of what I'm saying, and is something of an exception to the point I'm making about the broader region. Syria is also an exception because one is not able to say, really, that in Syria, as in Libya, that there is a central structure that has or exercises sovereignty over the country. Both Syria and Libya are examples of really contested sovereignties. And so the role of outside forces becomes just part of a number of contestations, and that applies to both of these countries. This is not to suggest, of course, that foreign powers have been kicked out of the region. I mean, you haven't had, in the past half a decade in the region, the same kind of thing that you had in Iran in 1979. I'm not suggesting that. However, what we're seeing, for example, in the case of the United States, is an attempt by that country, so by that state, to reduce its footprint in the Middle East. I won't use the word to pull out of the Middle East or withdraw, but at least to reduce its footprint in the Middle East. So in that respect, at least it was a kind of voluntary thing from the United States. Russia, of course, has been very aggressive in the past year in particular, and less so in the couple of years before that, but that's particularly in Syria. And that too, not entirely uninvited, I would say. I think that Russia's role in Syria is very much at the invitation of the Assad regime. This point is also not to suggest that there's any kind of complete pullout by any of these powers, and certainly by the United States, or that there's a great reluctance for intervention, what we're seeing in Syria and Libya in particular shows that there is a great appetite for intervention if these states believe that it's necessary and in their interests. But in a general sense across the region, there is this. And certainly in the case of Russia, the intervention has been increasing rather than decreasing in any way. Now, I make this point about the Middle East North Africa region as that region is reflected in the map behind us. So it's not including, for example, Afghanistan, which by some definitions is part of the Middle East and North Africa region. And it certainly doesn't include Pakistan, which by no definition is part of that region, but I think we really should be considering when we're talking about the role of foreign actors in the region, because what happens in Pakistan is quite very much related, certainly to Afghanistan, but also to Iran and other places in the region. So I'm just going to raise that and leave it there without going further on that point. My second point then is that in many of the Middle East and North Africa countries, many of the MENA countries, quote-unquote, foreign intervention is actually much more descriptive of intra-regional intervention. So it's not about the United States and Russia and France and Britain, etc., but much more about the role played by Saudi Arabia and Iran and the United Arab Emirates and Turkey now in Syria. And this is particularly, of course, with regard to Syria, but not only. We see similar kinds of things in Lebanon, in Egypt, in Libya, attempts of such things in Tunisia, certainly a few foreign hands in Palestinian politics, foreign within the region, I'm talking about, not outside of the region. And so I think it's important, despite all the talk this morning about Arab unity and unity within the MENA region, etc., it's important that we also consider, when we're talking about foreign intervention, the role of these forces that are within the region. And so, insofar as we might, those of us that do, might want to use the word revolution in this context, it's another word that I like to use, insofar as we might want to use that word, the major counter-revolutionary forces in the region are from the region and not from outside the region. What I'm saying then is that okay, let me move on. Let me just end this point by saying that the point that I made, that I think we need to consider then both these external and intra-regional forces. My third point then is that thus far what I've been speaking about, of course, is foreign intervention by states. We certainly also need to consider in this discussion intervention by other actors, particularly multilateral actors. And the record of this kind of intervention has not been great in the region. Consider the role of NATO in Libya. Consider the role of the United Nations in Syria and in all of the others, Yemen and other places in the region. It has been a role that has been at best described as problematic, but seriously destructive in other cases. But also in terms of multilateral organizations, the other role that perhaps we're not seeing as much now, but certainly we will be seeing more of in a kind of what's the term, post-crisis Middle East North Africa region, and that is the role of institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, etc., which will bring a different form of colonialism and colonization of the region that is less stark, less obvious than what we have seen in the past. And I think that these are what we need to consider very seriously. Even in a case like the Palestinian context in the West Bank, for example, which is not a state, there's no Palestinian state that exists, at best is a kind of municipal authority. even there, the kind of role that is played by institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and in general the banking industry has left Palestinians in the West Bank terribly indebted and essentially enslaved in various kinds of ways to particular economic interests. And so I'm coming to the end of my time, and I think I'll actually hit 10 minutes, unfortunately. So let me just quickly make my last point. And my last point is that when we're talking about international power and the role of the international forces, that the one point that we shouldn't ignore as well is the role of the people of the planet. That while we might talk a lot about the interventions that are made by states in the region, that we often then overlook the role that can be and often is played by people, including in those countries that have the most major interventions. Americans, for example. I don't know much about what Russian people think about or what interventions can be made among the Russian populace, for example, about the role that they play in Syria, etc. But I think it's a factor that we should not be ignoring. Thank you.